Hi everyone. So in this clip, I'm just going to go through my annotations, talk them through to you that I've made for the story from Foreign Soil, The Stilt Fisherman of Catalua. I didn't actually realize until I was going through these annotations where we're set in this story, but I actually did some Google imaging of the stilt fisherman and saw that it was a Sri Lankan practice, and Catalua comes up as Sri Lanka when you're Google it as well. So we've essentially got the story here of our protagonist, well, one of two really. The majority of this story is told from our protagonist Asanka's point of view, even though it's through a close third person. And it details through two time periods. We actually start with the use of italics, with him talking about his, or the narration talking about his journey from fleeing Sri Lanka due to being persecuted by militia groups, taking that perilous passage across the ocean and getting eventually to Australia, where he ends up we assume indefinitely. There's no reason in the story to think that he's ever getting out of there, in a detention centre in Sydney. So like that short story, David, we've got two dual narratives here, two people's points of view. It's largely Asanka's, and it goes from the past tense of him, that past event of him being on the boat and that passage of getting to Australia, and then his present situation of being in the detention centre. But we also get sections of the story told from the point of view of a lawyer and refugee activist named Loretta, who's trying to do her bit to see if she can help plead for asylum for any of the people in these asylum shelters. So I'm sort of jumping into a little way through the story with my annotations. I've just picked up on some key passages that I think give us a sense of the story overall. So even though my annotation is not starting here into the bottom of page 205, I just want to note, again, we've got the paragraph break structure of delineating between who the narrators are, because prior to that point, we've had the story from Loretta's point of view and her waking up in the morning and getting prepared to drive to the detention center and pay a visit to Asanka. And it notes here that as she's leaving, she grabs a handful of bobby pins from a bedside table, which is interesting foreshadowing, looking back on it, given what we know, that the story ends with Asanka taking one of those, being given one of those bobby pins, sharpening it into a needle of sorts and using it to sew his lips shut, to signify his distress and ironically, I guess, find a voice, because he otherwise doesn't have one. One of the motifs we get is the digital watch and the ticking of time and the counting of time. So it notes in this passage it had been given to Asanka by a lady from the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, which is a religious charity. So this is a small example, but I think the character Loretta's efforts to help asylum seekers is two examples of individuals or people working for charities or people with charitable ideas trying to do their best to help these people who have been locked up indefinitely in detention centres. But the reality, and I think this is the author views and values coming through here, is, and this is sort of the idea of critical race theory as well, is it can't just be up to individuals to challenge and change racism. And actually in this story, the message, one of the messages we seem to get is that individuals actually are quite powerless to change, you know, the discrimination in the lives of people who find themselves in these situations, because the power ultimately rests with institutions, in this case, the Australian government. And if the government has these policies that says, well, they're illegal asylum seekers, they've got no claim to be on Australian shores, they can't go back because they're going to be killed there though. So we're just going to leave them locked up and just sort of lock the doors and limit the public access and knowledge to these situations and hope people just sort of get on with their daily lives, which the majority of us arguably do. All right, so Asanka's in this cell he's ended up with. He's just still a young boy. Can't remember if we get the idea of exactly how young. But it's interesting, he says, he did not, one time the door was left unlocked, but he didn't bother trying to escape because he did not know what the Australians would do. The Tigers, which is what he calls the militia group, or the child soldiers even, who came for him and his friends, and was it amputated one of his fingers? They came back for him after a day in the potato chest, because we had this earlier story where they locked him and his friend up in a chest for a day as a way of sort of convincing them to join and fight with them. But these people, look at the use of language, they're talking about Australians, Australia, have locked him up for 1.5 years. So even though that was a really traumatizing event for him to be locked up in a potato chest for a whole day and have a finger chopped off, he's actually signaling here, or through the narration, it's signaling that what's being done to him in Australia is a whole lot worse than that. Yeah, I won't read through my own annotations there, but you can pause or you can look them up. I'm going to upload the annotations to resources as well. So one of the jailers, or whatever the technical term for them is, all right, mate, out of bed, come on. Big belly pauses at the door. So I forget which other story we saw this in, but we've got obviously some dehumanization of the white characters, or at the very least, characters who are monstrous, because actually when I wrote that annotation, I thought it was just the white characters, but actually it's the people who drive the boat over there, the ones who are profiting from it. He nicknames them Ponytail and Moustache as well. I mean, I guess it's partly because he doesn't know their name, but partly because they lose their identity through their cruelty or through their lack of connection. So yeah, we've got this structural device in this story of counting the time, which makes it a motif. Thinking about the tone, which is something I can always do for close reading as well. This ticking of time becomes quite grim once we get to the end of the narrative and we realize what the time has been leading up to. Like all of these experiences, all of this time ends up in the narrative with him sewing his lips together in an act of self-mutilation, characteristic of the distress he feels from being locked up, with not being able to return home, not being able to move forward, which is an interesting structural feature. All right, so even though we're written in the third person in this story, it is the close third person narrative. It's closely tied to Asankta's point of view. And the effect of that, before I do that, I can't think off the top of my head which other stories here might be using closed third person, but look out for that when you are starting to compare with other passages from other stories. And for me, one of the things that's happening there is, one, it's conveying the banality, meaning the boredom of just time ticking up. He stands up, he goes to the chest of drawers, the pajamas. I think it mentions he coughs at one point. Like the details of his day-to-day existence are so banal that, yeah, there's just really nothing else to comment on because nothing else is happening in his life. So that's one of the effects of that close third person narration. But the other effect of it, which is sort of diametrically opposed, is devastatingly how it conveys the trauma that he's gone through as well. Because as it says, when he stops counting, he will be back locked in that chest. They will shove him inside the fish hold. They will shut the lid and leave him there with the blood and the stink and the smell of fear. So the other effect of it is it helps us get an insight into his mind, which is already quite unstable at this point as well. He's deeply traumatized from his home country, where he was mutilated by the tigers and forced out of home. He's left on his own. I can't remember if we find out what happened to his parents, or if they're just not been able to buy a passage to safety to Australia for themselves. So instead they've just bought one for their son, but he's not seen his parents again. And he's gone through the harrowing details of trying to survive on the fishing boat, traveling across the seas. And now he's got this banal but equally, if not more terrible experience of being locked up in the detention center. And so that's being conveyed through that third person narrative as well, because it's in this section when we realize he's starting to lose a bit of, well, actually at this point, he's using that counting device to keep a grip on reality, to not get sucked up into his past. As the narrative progresses, we do get the sense, we do realize that he does lose touch with that and loses the ability to differentiate between what's his past trauma and what's his present. So Dinesh, who was someone on the boat with him, next to him, letting go of his bowels and wheezing, Dinesh will be dead and his face will already be decaying. So BC, that's my initials for Beneba Clark, our author, she's not shying away from a lot of gruesome imagery, but it's interesting because she pairs it with quite straightforward language as well. Like, we're not getting descriptive adjectives and adverbs. It's just sort of quite factual. But the reality is the facts themselves are quite horrifying. So we learn that a head doctor, some sort of counselor, psychologist, has been sent in, is, one facility that is offered to the asylum seekers in this facility. And this counselor doctor has reassured him, no one's coming to get him. He's safe now. It's all in his head, which I read as being quite ironic, because there are different forms of safety. Maybe, yes, he's not in danger of someone else making an attempt on his life or his livelihood anymore. But I think Beneba Clark is making us question, like, what is safety? If you're locked up in this cell, you're just a young boy, you've got no friends or family. The man who looked after him on the boat on the way over, I forget his name now, starts with C, come back to it later, Chaminda, who came on the boat over with him, looked after him on the boat, and has been put in the same cell as him initially, has succumbed to depression and has drunk bleach and died. So even his only friend that he did have at this point has gone. So is he really safe? I think Beneba Clark wants us to question that at this point as well. And anyway, the immigration wants to send him back inside the potato chest. So I think this is our first point that we start to get a sense that he is starting to lose a grip on reality at this point. Maybe immigration has told him they might be sending him back. They might be processing his claim and have decided he's not a genuine or a valid or legal asylum seeker. But the potato chest is what the Tiger Army put him in. So he's sort of, for him, the oppressors back home and the oppression of Australia have sort of become synonymous at this point, which is a real indictment on Australian society that Beneba Clark is making. All right, so at the visitor center, what's her name? The girl, Loretta? This is when I need you guys here to help me. What's her name? Yeah, it is Loretta. So she's made her way to the detention center. She's visited him. I think she was previously trying to help the friend Chaminda, but didn't end up being able to help him before he died. But now she's trying to notionally help Asanka. So this section is coming after she's paid that visit, and nothing has really come of it. But he's there in the visitor's room, and it says Asanka crosses his arms, tries to cover up the stains on his shirt. The blood is there. So again, we're starting to, as the narrative progresses, we're starting to get more and more instances of that signal to us as readers that this is an individual who's losing touch with reality. He is so deeply traumatized by the blood that he's seen, and which is sort of synonymous with death, that he sees it everywhere now. All right, but there's a picture of a map on the wall And here we get one of a couple of references to his father, but it's always in terms of a past memory. His father was a high school art teacher. His dad showed him a painting of Atlas, the Greek god who carries the world on his shoulders. Now, this is not the first time we've had a story that has allusions to or intertextual references to stories within stories or mythologies. In Shu Yi, we had Western fairy tales. Here we've got the origins of the Western canon, the Greek myths. So in one sense, it's an allusion to one of the bigger views and values of the text, which is sort of the nature of storytelling and why do we tell stories? And obviously for Beneba Clark, what's motivating her in a lot of her work is there's a political edge to why she's writing these stories. She wants to confront readers to think about what it means to be a person of color within the African diaspora, be it living in a colonized country, being an immigrant in Australia, being an asylum seeker in Australia in this case. But the other thing I'm wondering about is, because all of the stories, the intertextual references are Western stories, like the fairy tales, the ancient Greeks, it sort of makes me think about, and I don't know if this is just me reading into it, but where are the stories, where are the mythologies of African tales? And I think this points to the colonial history of a lot of these people in these communities, that if they've been colonized by white societies, then white people or white society has brought their stories with them to those places as well. So they're not telling their own stories anymore. They're being assimilated into white stories and white framings of viewing the world. So continuing that chain of thought then, is the creation of foreign soil and these short stories, is that a counter response of sorts? This is getting a bit meta, but maybe that's a good point that we could make there, that if so many of the stories that have dominated are the Western ones, maybe that's one of the political imperatives of Beneba Clark writing these set of short stories in the first place, so that there are stories that speak to experiences that aren't just the Western canon. All right, nonetheless though, there's a clear analogy being made here with the story of Atlas. The weight of the world is too heavy for even a god to bear. No matter how strong, how resolute, Atlas will eventually be crushed beneath it. So again, more use of foreshadowing. How much can a person bear sort of idea? Even a Greek god couldn't carry all of this pain for himself. So how possibly could a little boy like Asanka carry it as well? All right, we move then into the past event of the journey on the boat, and that's made pretty clear to us through the use of italics as well to signal we've traveled back in time. So we've got the non-linear narrative running through this story, which maybe is mirroring Asanka's frame of mind as well. Is he in the present or is he in the past? The reality is he's sort of both at once. He's living all of those narratives, or indeed particularly the trauma of all of those narratives is staying with him in the present. What have I said here? The monster that is the ocean is pulling at Asanka, because they're in a rickety boat, remember? And actually, it's not the first time that the ocean has been characterized as a monster through that use of metaphor. I think the opening sentence of the story, or up there at the very start of the story, that's the first time we get that reference to the ocean being a monster. However, I would challenge that. If I were writing on this, one of the things that strikes me is that, all right, so we've got the use of a metaphor to describe the ocean as a monster, and no doubt it did appear that way to Asanka because it would have been really perilous and the boat would have been terrible and not up to the standard of making a significant ocean passage. But it does introduce this notion of monstrosity, into the text. And I think what's interesting to note is, despite the fact that the narrative is positioning the ocean or nature as being monstrous, it's actually the actions of humans, or if not humans solely, then institutions or groups that are really doing the monstrous actions in this story. And we've got to think about how we might see that in other stories as well. All right, so it's in this passage that we get the best sense of where our title for the story comes from, the Stilt Fishermen of Kathalua, because Asanka has become a bit delirious. They're all starting to starve at this point, and so they've been reduced to having to actually just grab fish out of the sea and eat them raw, drink their blood as their only form of water as well. But Asanka has drunk some seawater, and so is becoming delirious. And in that delirium, he thinks he sees the fishermen who would fish on stilts. Actually, let me just find you a picture of it. No. Because I hadn't had an idea in my mind previously what that might look like. All right, so there they are. And they're in the middle of the sea at this point, obviously. These are fishermen who would just be fishing in the shallows, but Asanka thinks he can see them. He's feeling connected to his home at that point. If I go back to my annotations, maybe what we're getting here is his own personal mythology. Coming back to my point from earlier, that this is how he would like to remember what home is, despite the fact that the reality is that home is so terrible that he's had to leave it. But he thinks he's been talking to them, and in response to that, Shaminda and Ponytail exchange strange glances because they are obviously able to recognize that he's delirious at this point. So this is an example of dramatic irony where the reader can see something that our protagonist can't. All right, I think I made this point before. He needs water, they say. We need to get him fresh water, and Shaminda looks like he's going to cry. So again, there's this real understatement to the narrative voice, like it's devastating. And I think part of what Beneba Clark is doing here is, through understatement, she's able to make that devastation come through even more clearly. She's not trying to dress it up with really evocative language, because the facts sort of speak for themselves. Like, the facts are awful. It would be an awful thing for anyone to undertake getting there. And then once you're in asylum, just this, we think we know what it's like being in lockdown, but this would be a million times worse. So as I've said, the reader fills in the blanks of much of the heartache and becomes more powerful because of that. All right, back to the switch in perspective where we've got Loretta. But I am moving on to, I think, my second last passage now. All right, so he's met with Loretta. He's asked for a gift of some toiletries. She's given him some of her bobby pins and the floss. That imagery of blood is continuing for Asanka. And we start to get the description now, and it's in quite a lot of detail, even though it's not terribly evocative. It's much more factual in the way it's narrated, but he gets the thin hairpins. And what follows is obviously the description of him sharpening them into a needle and using the floss to sew his mouth shut, which is a practice, unfortunately, that has happened from asylum seekers who are so traumatized and so silenced that they see this as their only way to sort of have a voice and try to appeal to whoever might be able to and willing to listen to them. And I think maybe, as I've said here, this act of self-mutilation is made more terrible by the fact that it's not immediately clear what he's about to do. At least it wasn't to me. But it doesn't take long to figure it out. It says he can't feel anything. He is already dead. He does not exist anymore. He's numb to the pain. Now, this is metaphorical language. He's not literally dead. He doesn't literally not exist anymore. But even though that language is metaphorical, it's sort of interesting because maybe in a lot of ways it's actually not that far from the literal truth. He's legally not being granted any rights in Australia. So in a way, it's almost becoming sort of literal language that it's true, he doesn't exist. And we can really clearly see through the progression of the narrative in this story how an individual might have been led to do something like that, to be pushed to that point of desperation. We don't want to imagine it, but Beneba Clark wants us to. She wants us to confront that, because especially for those of us who are white and reading this, a lot of our privilege means that, or even if we're a person of color, if we don't have a asylum seeker background, that is our privilege to be able to turn away from the reality of something like that. All right, so he is thinking, if he just slipped quietly into the water in the dead of night, if he disappeared off the boat, then in the morning, people would wonder whether he was ever actually there at all. They would not even remember his name. So the psychosis is clear at this point. He's not able to distinguish any longer at all between what was the journey over here and what is the current reality, even while the narrative structure still makes that very clear to us as readers. But this point here that they, and note the pronoun they, to sort of signify how impersonal Australia is. Not even remember his name. I think Beneba Clark is questioning the institutional factors that lead to us not remembering his name. I mean, there have been asylum seekers who have had very similar stories to Asanka in this fictional tale, who have committed the acts upon themselves that he commits as well. Sometimes we might see a clip of it in the news or something like that, but does those stories really stay with us beyond those news clips? I mean, I'm guilty of this myself. I think they don't, and that's why we need stories, because stories hit us emotionally, whereas the news, by and large, is designed to hit us factually, logically. So again, yeah, she's trying to make us question, why don't we remember the names and the stories of people like these? Maybe we need to start doing that. So it's quite grotesque, even though, again, it's factual. He pulls the pin all the way through his lip. It leaves a bloody hole, but it does not hurt. I think one of the questions that are being raised for us there is, has he done this to himself? Now, literally, obviously, the answer is yes, he's the one doing it. But figuratively, or on a deeper level, who is responsible for this happening to him? Is it the oppressive system he's came from, or is it the one he's currently under in Australia? I think the answer is probably a mixture of both, but what we can't get away from is that institutionally, from a government point of view, Australia is contributing. I think this is Beneba Clark's argument, and you can agree or disagree in your writing, that the government is contributing to this trauma that these people are experiencing. So this is a similar point I'm making here about the blood. So this has been going for pages now. We're still on the act of him sewing his lips together. Beads of blood gather beneath his bottom lip and above the top one, wringing his mouth in red. He doesn't feel anything. The head doctor was right. The blood isn't there. He is safe, which is just deeply sad and distressing at this point. What have I written? Beneba Clark is sparing no details for readers about the logistics of this act. She is forcing us all to watch. We can no longer claim not to know. So yeah, the activism behind her writing. So he stops for a moment, admiring the 8 perfectly vertical mint-scented stitches that he's used to sew his mouth shut. It's interesting that the use of the verb admiring there, because it sort of would normally imply like a creative act that you've done, like finishing an artwork or something like this, something else that you would craft. So this has been carefully crafted, his work, and he's happy with the job he's done, which we could either read as him being delusional at this point, or maybe he recognizes that this is going to be